Today, we dive back into some CTA history. In episode 2 of The Oldest Rails, I'll be taking a look at the Yellow Line. The Yellow Line, if you're not familiar with it, is a very unique line in the CTA's network. It's less than 5 miles in length and has only 3 stations. Only the line's southern terminus at Howard Street is actually located in the city of Chicago itself, with the rest of the line being in the suburbs of Evanston and Skokie. The line is unique in these ways, as well as many others, which, in turn, gives it a very unique history. Because the line is so short, it doesn't really have an oldest section in the way that the other lines in the network do. As such, this video will really serve as a full History of the Yellow Line video. Even so, the story of the Yellow Line is actually quite an interesting one. So, let's dive in. Now, technically speaking, Howard Yard and the turnback sidings at the southern end of the line, which are just south of Howard Station, are some 17 years older than the rest of the line, which would make these truly the oldest rails in the Yellow Line. But a video just on this station and its associated terminal facilities, while it could be interesting, wouldn't really fit with my goal for the series. As such, I'm going to stick with the history of the entire line. However, I am going to start here, at Howard. The station was opened in 1908 by the Northwestern Elevated Railroad, who we learned about in the last episode when we looked at the Red Line. The station initially opened as a simple through station on the line from Chicago to Evanston, which was eventually extended to reach Wilmette. While the line and station were operated exclusively by the Northwestern, it became a stop along the cooperative Crosstown L service, which began in 1913, when the Northwestern partnered with the Southside Rapid Transit Company, along with several other elevated railroads, and provided direct service from the northern suburbs to the south side via downtown. In 1919, 2 important events occurred around this section of the line. Firstly, the schedule of Crosstown L trains was shifted so that some northbound trains coming from Jackson Park would begin short turning at Howard instead of running all the way to Linden. While this was a relatively minor change on the surface, it was the beginning of Howard becoming a terminal station. Slowly, over time, Howard Street Station began to gain the terminal facilities that are now the Howard Shop and Yard. Secondly, in that year, the Chicago North Shore and Milwaukee Railroad, commonly referred to as the North Shore Line, entered into a trackage rights agreement with the elevated railroads. As the name Chicago North Shore and Milwaukee Railroad might suggest, the North Shore Line connected the cities of Chicago and Milwaukee via the North Shore area. The trackage rights agreement allowed them to connect their line at Linden Avenue and run down the length of the Northwestern's main line, into the loop and all the way through to Roosevelt Road. The North Shore Line trains would operate express, making good use of the 4-track line on the north side, and the Northwestern and other L companies provided local service along the route. This worked well for the North Shore Line, and the area along the North Shore was developing fast, so ridership was easy to come by. Unfortunately, by the early 1920s, the area soon became so congested that traffic was slowed and service for passengers between Chicago and Milwaukee began to degrade. In order to combat this issue, the North Shore Line began construction on a new line which would serve as a cutoff, or bypass route, diverging from the main line at Howard and running on an inland route near the route of the Skokie River. The line would rejoin the North Shore's main line in Lake Bluff, Illinois, to the north of the most congested area. Construction of the Skokie Valley Line began in 1923, just 1 year before Chicago's elevated railways formally merged into the Chicago Rapid Transit Company, or the CRT. In 1925, the CRT entered into another agreement with the North Shore Line, whereby the CRT would operate local service on a portion of the Skokie Valley line as well. The new route, known as the Niles Center branch, ran from Howard Street up to the first station along the North Shores route, which was Dempster Street in the village of Niles Center. The CRT, however, built their own intermediate stations along the route, at which their trains could provide local service. The line ran below grade in an open cutting from Howard and through the city of Evanston, where CRT stops were added at Ridge Avenue and Asbury Avenue before the line ascended onto an elevated structure. An elevated station was located over Dodge Avenue, west of which the line descended to grade level in the village of Niles Center itself. Additional stations were located in Niles Center at Crawford and East Prairie Avenues and Cosner Avenue, before the line curved northward with more stations at Oakton Street and Main Street before trains finally reached the North Shoreline station at Dempster, where the CRT line terminated. The line itself had a remarkably uneventful history over the course of the next 15 years. Niles Center and the areas of Evanston that were served by the line were extremely sparsely populated, and the line received relatively little use. The CRT hoped that the line would draw development to the area, but the Great Depression unfortunately stalled this prospect. Perhaps the only thing of note was the construction of a new CRT shop facility, which was constructed in the late 1920s and was used primarily for railcar painting. The Niles Center line itself lacked any sort of dedicated shop or yard facility, considering the line terminated in the middle of another railroad's main line. All operations were based out of the yard at Howard. The new paint shop, however, was located just to the north of the right-of-way, just east of Crawford East Prairie Station, with a track connection to the Niles Center branch here. The location of the new shop was also right around the part of the line where outbound trains transitioned from third rail power to overhead wire. Although I can't find any sources to confirm this presumably would have occurred at Crawford East Prairie Station, where the tracks descended to grade level. This meant that the tracks leading to the shop were third rail electrified, and nearly all CRT vehicles, even those that did not have overhead electrical equipment, could reach the shop if needed. This helped in ongoing efforts to begin centralizing maintenance of railroad equipment. In 1940, the village of Niles Center was renamed to Skokie to avoid confusion with the nearby village of Niles. However, there's no record that the name of the CRT's line was ever changed. On October 1st, 1947, the Chicago Transit Authority took control of all the CRT's operations and assets. There was a massive need in Chicago for streamlining and consolidation of railroad operations. Among the many measures that the CTA took, one of these was a centralization of heavy rail maintenance. The CTA had inherited numerous shop facilities located all over the city, many of which were aging severely, and nearly all were from the era of the private railroads before the CRT. The one exception to this was the new shop on the Niles Center branch. The CTA began expansion of this facility and a migration of many shop operations to this site. The consolidation of shops, however, was an improvement measure on a relatively small scale compared to what the CTA system needed. The current Chicago rail network was a mess of old lines from various ages and operational structures that had grown up and mashed together over time. Big changes had to come if efficiency is to be improved, and it didn't take an expert to realize that the Niles Center branch was a prime candidate for such drastic measures. The line had never been profitable and continued to carry embarrassingly low ridership. Growth of the area, which had just been stunted by the Great Depression, had once again been squashed by World War II, and hopes of further development of Skokie seemed dim. On March 27, 1948, less than 6 months after the CTA began operations, the employees of the North Shore Line began a planned strike. The North Shore Line closed for the duration of the strike, and since they operated the railroad, the CTA had to close the Niles Center branch too. Rather than institute some form of temporary replacement service, the CTA instead created an entirely new permanent bus route. The number 97 Skokie bus ran between Howard and Skokie, serving a very similar area to the Niles Center branch, including a stopover at the Dempster terminal. On June 30th of that year, the North Shore Line finally resolved to raise fares, which allowed them to raise workers' wages, leading to the end of the strike. Service on the North Shore Line resumed, but CTA service on the line did not. The intermediate stations between Howard and Dempster remained closed indefinitely. The CTA continued to make use of its trackage rights on the North Shore Line, only to reach the shop facility in Skokie. Rather ironically, over the course of the 1950s and 60s, development in the Skokie area took a massive leap. However, that wasn't the only thing that changed during these years. Automobile usage was on the rise. A massive web of expressways was constructed across the country, including in Chicago. With increased automobile usage, the profitability of railroads continued to decline. In 1958, the North Shore Line began the process of abandoning all of their operations. The company was dragged through a number of legal procedures, but on January 21st, 1963, the last passenger trains finally made their runs on this line, and the abandonment process truly began. This, however, had serious implications for the CTA, because it would have meant the abandonment of the Skokie Valley line. This line now connected the CTA's primary shop facility. In order to prevent this, the CTA purchased the southernmost portion of the Skokie Valley route from the North Shore Line. They not only purchased the section from Howard to Skokie shops, but also the section leading up to their old Dempster station. With the surrounding area continuing to develop, the CTA was considering resuming some service on this route. However, it was clear that an exact replica of the original service was still not going to be practical. Private automobiles still continued to carry a majority of travelers to and from Skokie. The CTA, accepting this fact, opted to create a service model that would work well with this traffic flow. The number 97 Skokie bus continued to run to allow passengers to connect to both Howard Station and the old Dempster Station, which was reopened with a large bus terminal and parking lot. A high-speed, non-stop shuttle service was run between Howard and Dempster. The intermediate stations, which had been closed in the 1940s, remained closed. The thought was, as the automobile-centric population was spread farther away from the city, the majority of traffic would come from passengers who drove into Dempster, and when they did drive in, they would prefer a faster service with no stops. The new service was given the name Skokie Swift, seeing as it was a high-speed service which served Skokie. The grade-level stations in Skokie were demolished before the start of the new service. The visual obstruction they presented on the grade-level line was a safety hazard, given the speed at which the trains traveled and the numerous road crossings. While the Evanston stations remained for the next decade or so, these too were eventually demolished. The new service was unlike any other service the CTA had operated. With no intermediate stops, it became the first CTA route where at all times it would operate with only one crew member on board. Station staff at Howard and Dempster would collect passenger fares, and the doors only needed to be controlled at the beginning and end of the trip, and they were always on the right-hand side of the train, so this could easily be accomplished by the train's motorman, thus eliminating the need for a conductor. Trains also had to transition power sources in the middle of the line, as opposed to raising or lowering pantographs while stopped at a station platform. This meant that trains that worked the line would not only need to be capable of achieving the high speeds intended, but also making this at-speed power transition, which none of the trains in the CTA's fleet were currently equipped for. The new service began as a 2-year experiment, referred to as a demonstration of the line. From the onset, the CTA took precautions against overspending on and over-preparing for a service that had historically proven to be unpopular. The service was only to run on weekdays. The CTA converted 4 cars from the 1 to 50 series to to be able to run on the line. Although married pair cars were beginning to become mainstream, this series of cars was the last one that the CTA purchased that still had motor cabs at both ends, meaning that single-car trains could run the service. The CTA figured that even during peak hours, 2 single-car trains shuttling back and forth could cover demand, and then there would be 2 trains in reserve. The CTA also chose not to reopen the North Shore Line station at Dempster, especially considering the service was only intended to last for 2 years. If the experiment was unsuccessful, a significant amount of money would be wasted in reopening and restoring the old building. Instead, 2 short side platforms, each only long enough to berth 2 cars, were constructed, and simple shelters and temporary structures were built around these platforms, with the main feature of the station being a large park-and-ride lot and bus terminal. The line to the north of Dempster was abandoned and eventually removed. The southbound track was left in service for several car lengths to the north of the station, leaving a space for trains to reverse and switch to the inbound platform to begin the trip back to Howard. Service, however, massively outperformed the modest expectations that the CTA had placed on it. This was most likely because these expectations were based on the Niles Center branch and the North Shore Line, both of which were operating service models which had simply become outdated. The CTA's new service model, more consistent with travel patterns at the time, proved to be significantly more popular. The service began on Monday, April 20th, 1964. And on the opening day alone, the line carried 3,939 passengers, well over twice the expected ridership, and this number only grew in the coming years. Just within the first week of service, it was apparent that the line was going to be more successful than expected. On Saturday, April 25th, the first weekend that the line was open, the CTA decided to still operate the service, even though it was originally only intended to run Monday through Friday. This too was popular, and the service schedule was adjusted to run Monday through Saturday instead. Frequency also had to be increased well beyond expectation. The 4 cars initially assigned to the service proved to be inadequate. To cover this, the CTA converted some of the old articulated 5000 series cars, delivered in 1947, to cover this shortage. More 1-50 series cars were converted as they could be spared to cover the service needs of the line. Needless to say, in 1966, when the 2-year experiment period was over, the Skokie Swift became an official permanent CTA route. Despite the unexpected success of the route, the Skokie Swift saw relatively little change over the first 30 years of its service. The temporary station structures at the Dempster station continued to be used, despite the fact that the line was now intended to be a permanent feature. Perhaps the only thing of major interest that occurred during this time was the brief experiment with the use of the U.S. Department of Transportation's state-of-the-art cars. This was an experiment in the mid-1970s with a goal to aid transit systems around the country in modernization by creating an experimental train set which exhibited all of the latest technology in rapid transit rail design, and showing it off to the transit operators and the general public alike by running it on different transit networks around the country. There were, of course, issues with trying to create a train that is compatible with so many transit systems. The BART system in San Francisco, for instance, had to be excluded from the experiment due to the broad gauge that their trains use. And light rail systems, such as this one in St. Louis, would have required a completely different kind of vehicle if they were to be included in the experiment. The state-of-the-art train set was designed using a B division railcar from the New York City subway as a base. The B division lines have larger tunnels than the A division lines, and as such, when the new cars were tested in New York, they could only operate in the former, as the tight tunnels on the A division could not accommodate. However, the situation was even more challenging when the cars did make their way to Chicago. Out of the 6 lines that the CTA operated at the time, 5 of them had combinations of tight curves and low overhead clearances that made them unsuitable for the state-of-the-art cars. The Skokie Swift, however, seemed like a promising option, having been designed for large mainline trains to run out in the wider, more open suburban areas. Even then, though, the state-of-the-art trains were too wide to clear the edge of the station platforms. To get around this, the CTA actually chopped off a foot or so of the platform along the trackside edge of the platforms at Dempster and installed a retractable platform edge to fill this space when regular rolling stock was operating. One of the platforms at Howard was similarly fitted. Despite the fact that I just took up half a page in my notes for this video to talk about the state-of-the-art cars, they only ran on the Skokie Swift for a grand total of 13 days in January of 1975. They really only registered a small blip in the line's history. The only other thing of note to happen in these early years of the line was the introduction of the 2600 series cars in 1983. These cars went into service on the west-northwest route and allowed all the 1-50 series cars in this route to be transferred over to the Skokie Swift. In turn, this allowed the CTA to retire the 5000 series cars which were running on the Skokie Swift at the time. The 1990s finally brought some significant events in the history of the line. Indeed, the entirety of the CTA network experienced a number of changes in that decade. In April of 1991, the CTA began a project to reconstruct the aging tracks between Howard and Dempster. To accomplish this, Saturday service was temporarily suspended to allow crews full access to the tracks over the weekends. A dedicated shuttle bus was operated between Howard and Dempster on Saturdays, supplementing the number 97 bus to compensate for the loss of rail service. In July of the same year, work had progressed to the point where weekend-only work was no longer an option. Rail service was suspended and replaced by shuttle buses at all times. By November, track work had been completed, and rail service finally resumed on the line. Service returned to operating Monday through Saturday, but this would prove to be brief. February of 1992 found the CTA tight on funds and making several service cuts and closures to make ends meet. Saturday service on the Skokie Swift became a victim of one of these cuts, with February 8th being the last Saturday that service was run, before shifting indefinitely to a Monday to Friday schedule the following week. About a year later, on February 21st, 1993, the CTA rebranded all of its lines to use color codes. The Skokie Swift was officially renamed to be the Yellow Line. However, the Skokie Swift logo, created for the original 1964 demonstration, is still used in a variety of places on the line, including on the train's destination signs. And the Skokie Swift name continues to be used by many who still fondly remember it, and it definitely still sees more use than any of the network's other legacy names. In October of 1993, the CTA opened the Orange Line to Midway Airport. As a result of the new line, the CTA acquired a new series of railcars, the 3200 series. 16 of the cars in this new set were built with pantographs for use on the Yellow Line, making the first purpose-built cars for this unique service. As a result, the last of the old 1950s era cars were able to be retired. Since only 2 cars were used per train set, this made 8 separate train sets which could operate on the Yellow Line. This proved to be more than necessary for the line, so several cars had their pantographs removed and were transferred to the Brown Line, which needed more trains as it was struggling to keep up with the high ridership it was experiencing. These cars, however, retained the roof boards to which the pantographs had been attached, so one can actually tell which Brown Line cars used to be on the Yellow Line. Also in 1993, the CTA began work on a new terminal facility at Dempster. Overall, the layout would be much the same as the temporary station that had existed for the last 29 years. For now, the CTA contented themselves with building a new permanent station house and platforms. Further redevelopment of the station's park and ride and bus facilities were planned as well, but these would call for either the demolition or relocation of the North Shoreline's old terminal building, which was well loved by the general public. The new Dempster Station facility opened in May of 1994. The mid-1990s also saw an overall rebranding effort of the CTA's suburban stations. Until this time, CTA stations in municipalities outside of Chicago, such as Forest Park and Skokie, had been named after their cross streets, much like the stations within the city. After all, the CTA was a Chicago-based agency. Their primary purpose was not to serve the suburbs. However, throughout the mid-90s, the CTA began to reverse this and update some of the suburban station names. In 1995, Dempster Station was officially renamed to Skokie. Several more years would go by before the Dempster terminal finally saw the conclusion of the reconstruction project, which began in 1993. Over 2002 and 2003, the old North Shoreline terminal building was finally relocated just off to the side of the site and remodeled into a retail space. In November of 2003, Starbucks was the first tenant to take up residence in this building, and as of the date of this video, they remain at this location. By December of 2003, the CTA was finally able to open the new bus and parking facilities on the former site of the old station building. A major change came to the Yellow Line in 2004 when the CTA converted the northern end of the Yellow Line to third rail power, thus eliminating the need for the overhead wire, which was soon removed. At the conclusion of this transition, the entirety of the CTA network was now a third rail powered system. Over the years to come, the 3200 series cars on the Yellow Line progressively had their pantographs removed. Later still, all of these cars ended up being transferred over to the Brown Line. A number of older 2600 series cars were transferred over to the Yellow Line to cover this service instead. This left all three of the lines which operated out of Howard Yard using predominantly 2600 series cars, and kept the 3200 series cars concentrated on the orange and brown lines. This would improve efficiency of yard and shop operations so that different car types could be kept at the same locations. In 2008, the CTA board approved new funding that would allow the Yellow Line to operate service 7 days a week. On Sunday, March 30th of that year, the Yellow Line operated regular service for the first time on a Sunday. The following Saturday, April 5th, saw the first regular Saturday service operate on the line since 1992, and service has operated 7 days a week ever since. The following year, in 2009, the CTA began taking delivery of new rolling stock, numbered the 5000 series, not to be confused with the 5000 series cars which had run on the Yellow Line many years ago in the Skokie Swift days. How fitting, though, that as Howard Yard was eventually filled with the new 5000 series cars for the benefit of the red and purple lines, the Yellow Line 2 was soon run with only these cars by the early 2010s. In 2012, the CTA built a new station on the site of the CRT's old station at Oakton Street in Skokie. The Yellow Line began serving this station on April 30th of that year, thus changing the long-standing nature of the line as a non-stop shuttle. At 3 stations, however, it still maintains the record for the fewest stations on a line, and the gap between Howard and Oakton stations remains the longest interstation gap on the network. The new station was officially opened as Oakton Skokie, with the original Skokie station being renamed to Dempster Skokie.
Welcome aboard Yellow Line run 592. Oakton Skokie is next. Doors open on the left at Oakton Skokie. Smoking, littering, and eating are prohibited on CTA vehicles.
On May 17, 2015, work was being performed at the O'Brien Water Reclamation Plant, adjacent to the Yellow Line tracks. A mistake on the contractor's part caused an embankment to collapse on top of the railroad tracks. Service on the Yellow Line was suspended for more than 5 months while repairs were made and cleanup was completed. The line resumed service on October 30th. A similar situation occurred on November 16, 2023, although this time it was the fault of the CTA, when a Yellow Line train collided with a non-revenue snowplowing train, which had been left on the middle of the line that ran through Howard Yard. The accident was one of the worst in recent CTA history. So bad that in the immediate aftermath of the accident, the National Transportation Safety Board ordered that the Yellow Line be closed for safety investigations. Initially, the CTA simply redirected Yellow Line passengers to the number 97 Skokie bus, but as the closure grew longer and longer, a dedicated replacement bus was instituted. The Yellow Line finally reopened for revenue service on January 5th, 2024. And that, in just under half an hour, is a brief history of the entirety of the Yellow Line. This year will mark 100 years since the tracks on which it operates were first opened by the North Shore Line. The line has seen a surprising amount of history for its small size. If you enjoyed this history sort of video, stick around as I plan to do these for the remaining 6 lines of the system as time goes on. And you can also see my video on the oldest rails on the Red Line, which is linked in the corner here. A full playlist of all the oldest rails videos can be found in the video description. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.
All passengers must leave